Hey guys, American Pizza Books here. I'm back with another video. I hope that you guys had a good New Year's Eve, and stuff like that. I know I've already uploaded a video, I think, since then with the Adam Neville book collection. And I want to do another video here doing a review of this book, which I believe that probably most people who read horror are probably familiar with. And definitely familiar with this author, but that is The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum. So this is actually the first book by Jack Ketchum that I've ever read. I've heard a bunch about this author. I've heard a bunch of good things about him. I just had never really, cracked into his work at all, or, taken the time to buy one of his works. Not because I didn't want to read his stuff, just because there's so many authors that I currently read and want to get into that, I just didn't really think to check into Jack Ketchum's work, but he's another author that's been around for a while. I believe his first book was released in 1981, so he came along not too long after Stephen King and Kuntz and people like that. Now, I think most people are probably familiar with the plot of this book. Excuse me one second. But yeah, so if you're not familiar with this, now this is actually loosely based on a true story of Sylvia Likens, I believe her name was. There was an actual case where this girl went to live with, I think it was, I don't know if it was her aunt in the actual true story, but essentially the same sort of thing happened to her that happens in this book. So this is kind of loosely based on a true story, but loosely is the key term there. But if you're not familiar with the plot or the basic premise of this book, so Meg and Susan, their sisters, their parents die in a car crash, and they're also in the crash. They survive, but their parents die, and so they're sent to live with their Aunt Ruth and her 3 sons. And we're told all this through the perspective of David, who is, the neighbor, hence the title, The Girl Next Door. And he's friends with the sons of Aunt Ruth, or Ruth. I call her Aunt Ruth because I think I'm getting confused with the movie, because I've also seen the movie. There was a movie adaptation of this in 2007, and I believe in the movie she tells David to call her Aunt Ruth. So that's probably why I'm saying Aunt Ruth, but he knows Ruth, knows her very well. She's well known around the neighborhood. It is kind of like one of those small neighborhoods where everyone knows each other and stuff. That's kind of the setting of this book. But, these sisters go to live with their aunt, and in the beginning, things seem okay, but as the story goes on, things get progressively worse and worse and worse and worse for Meg and Susan. They both suffer abuse at the hands of their aunts and eventually at the hands of their cousins. Meg in particular, although there are a few times where Susan takes the brunt of the abuse, at the expense of Meg, because, Meg did something to, piss Ruth off, and so therefore Susan has to take the punishment for her. And that is the basic premise. And like I said, we're told all this through the eyes of David. And David is, I forget the exact term for it, not necessarily an unreliable narrator, but he's not really a clear-cut protagonist or antagonist. I believe there's a term for that. I just can't remember the term for it at the moment. But there's been a lot of differing opinions on the main character of David. Some people really, really don't like him, just as they hate him almost as much as they hate Ruth, if not more so, because throughout the course of this book, he does just kind of stand by and let a lot of this stuff happen and doesn't really do anything about it. Other people are more conflicted. I personally fall into the more conflicted category. There were times where I was frustrated with David because, he saw some of the fucked up stuff that was happening to Meg, and I just kept thinking, how can you not see this as being fucked up and wrong? But the thing to remember is that David is, I think, 12 years old. He's a kid, And this takes place in, I believe, the year 1958, back in the 50s. So it was a very different time. And back then, because in this current day and age, things like this are taken much, much more seriously. But back then, it probably would have been the parents or the guardians' words against the kids. And so, in David's defense as a character, I'm sure that he probably felt, and this is how he feels multiple times throughout the story, that there's really not much he really can do. But at a certain point in the story, he reaches a breaking point and decides that he does have to do something about it, because his friendship and relationship with not only his friendship with Ruth's sons, but his sort of friendship with Ruth herself conflicts a lot with his friendship, his newfound friendship and attraction to Meg, because there is that element here. There never really is any like romantic stuff or romantic things between David and Meg in this book. It never reaches that point. There is a bit of an age, not really. There's like, because David's 12, Meg is 14, but it never reaches that point of them having like a romantic fling or anything like that. But if things hadn't transpired the way that they did, it's implied that maybe could have been a possibility. But yeah, so that's the basic premise, and that's how a lot of people more or less feel about David. For me personally, I didn't hate David. I understood his indecision, even if at times I found it frustrating. I think what matters is that eventually he did at least try to do something, and I think there's even a line in this book where Meg says, this isn't a perfect, I can't, this is just me paraphrasing the line, basically, but at one point in the book she does say, it's what you do in the end, ultimately, or what you try to do in the end that matters, something along those lines, and that is what David does. So, ultimately, I really don't hate David. I don't, nowhere near as much as Ruth or even her sons, which you really, really come to, and even with the sons, even with Ruth's kids, like, yes, you dislike them because they are ultimately, and especially at the end of this book, they are just a bunch of bullies and abusers and stuff. But you also see that it's not entirely their fault, because they have Ruth as their mother, and Ruth is very much encouraging and influencing, these boys to act this way. So it's really hard to hold it entirely against them. Even though, again, I'm not saying it excuses what they do, but I'm just saying that because they're being encouraged by an adult figure who is supposed to be, guiding them and trying to teach them what is right and wrong, because they're being encouraged and okayed by this, by their mother, it's hard to put the blame entirely on them. And although what they do is not in any way excusable at all, I just want to make that clear. I'm not saying it's excusable. Like, you can see that it's not entirely on them, and that the only reason that they're doing what they're doing is because they are under the influence of this, so-called parental figure. So it's hard to completely view them as, I guess you could say, like, antagonists, because ultimately at the end of the day, Ruth is the ultimate antagonist in this book. This book it's horror in the most real sense. Stuff like this, it happens even today. It happens all the time where, kids are abused at the hands of either parental figures or guardian figures who are supposed to care for them and love them and, just bring them up right and provide a decent household for them to grow up in. Like, you are supposed to protect your kids, even if they aren't, like, even if they're just your nieces or nephews or whatever. Like, it's family. You're supposed to protect and love your family. especially when it comes to kids, to your own kids and stuff. Now, I'm not a parent, but I think that's pretty universally understood. And it's just the abuse that happens is stuff that happens like all the time. And the book, as well as the movie, is very, very disturbing. Now, I did see the movie before I read the book. I saw the movie long before I read the book, and the movie was quite disturbing to me. It really, really, it really rattled me. And I've seen a lot of horror movies and stuff, but the movie adaptation of this book, it really disturbed me. It scared me, not in the sense of like, oh, jump scares or some bullshit like that. It genuinely horrified and disturbed me, which it should. That's the whole point. It should horrify and disturb you. If it doesn't, there's probably something wrong with you. But yeah, it's like I said, it's horror in the most real sense. The I guess I'll talk about some of the other aspects of it. So, there's obviously I've basically discussed the characters. There's obviously David. There you also meet some of the other kids in the neighborhood. There's Eddie, who is kind of a psychopath in the making. There's also his sister Denise, who's basically the same way. There's other kids too around the block that you're introduced to, albeit briefly, or you might see a few times. And the thing is that some of the other kids in the neighborhood also come down to witness the abuse of Meg several times. And it's the same thing with them as it is with Ruth's own kids, because, these are like kids ranging from like 10 to 11, 12 years old. And especially in this time in the 50s, parental figures were viewed as the ultimate authority. So, if an adult figure is okaying this and doing this and watching over this, then it must not be that bad, right? I mean, it's not true, but I'm just trying to, it explains why a lot of these kids, with the exception of David, don't really think to do something or think, well, this is fucking wrong. So it's hard to, again, blame them entirely and view them as bad entirely, with the exception of maybe Eddie, because like I said, Eddie is, like a psychopath in the making. It does have to do with his upbringing and his household, but even still, you can tell that he's, when he gets older, which is one thing that I wish we could have learned more later on in the book, is how some of these kids turned out. But yeah, with the exception of that kid's definitely fucking crazy. But aside from that, you meet a lot of them. There's David, there's Ruth. Ruth, in a way, she kind of, I don't know why, but she kind of reminded me of Annie Wilkes from Stephen King's Misery. And maybe that's because of her sudden mood swings and manic episodes in this book. I think that's probably why she reminded me of Annie Wilkes. Not necessarily the same character. They're very different people, but still, it kind of reminded me of Annie Wilkes from that aspect. But Ruth is just the reason that she is so hateable and what makes her so terrifying is that there are people like this all over. These people like Ruth exist in this world who abuse their kids or kids they're supposed to be the guardian of. It happens all the time. People like that exist all over. So that's what makes Ruth so hateable and so horrifying as an antagonist. You obviously meet the sons, and I thought that Ruth's kids were actually pretty well nuanced. There is Donnie, who David is probably the closest with. He describes Donnie as being basically his best friend, or as close to a best friend as you could have in those days. And it's shown that Donnie, out of all the three sons, Donnie is the most hesitant to do anything to Meg. In the beginning, he's more hesitant about all the abuse that's being inflicted upon her. But midway through the book, you see him also, basically flip entirely and start taking part fully in the abuse of Meg, which, you know, it was kind of disappointing to see, because you think, well, maybe, like, you know, maybe with the, you know, Donnie would be the exception, and maybe he might try to help Meg as well, but that doesn't end up happening. And you understand why, because Ruth is his mother, and it's his family and stuff. So eventually, he's going to fall to the will of his own mother. You know, again, he's also like 12. All these kids that are involved are, I think Meg is like 14. She's the oldest. All the other kids are like ranged again from like, I think 10 to 12. I think Susan was 10, I believe. So yeah, like 10 to 12 in that age range. And then you have her other two kids, Willie and Ralphie, although they nickname him Woofer. And they're kind of one and the same. They're far less hesitant about the abuse of Meg, and they take full part in it almost from the beginning. So, yeah, so I thought that the characters were pretty well done. The characters who were hateable were definitely hateable, and you know, there really isn't a likable character in, well, aside from Meg and Susan. Meg was very, very, you felt so bad for Meg. I felt awful for Meg. You feel so awful for her because of all the shit that she has to go through, and especially at the end of the book. And it's all so needless, like all abuse is, and needless cruelty. And you just feel so bad for her. Same with her sister Susan, you know. And you got to imagine, like, what is Susan left with after witnessing all this, all the trauma that she has to deal with and stuff. David is... It's hard to say that David is a likable character because, again, like, even though I am more conflicted and I do understand David's own confliction, it's easy to hate David at times because, you know, again, he sees all this stuff going down but does nothing. You know, and again, like I said, I think it's important to remember that he is a 12-year-old kid, and this was a different time when things like this weren't taken as seriously. But even still, you know, it's hard to even consider David to be likable at times. But I thought the characters were well done. I thought the writing was excellent. You know, this definitely will not be my last Jack Ketchum book. I'll definitely read more of his work, but I love the writing. You know, the pacing of this book was also excellent. The book moved. The pacing was solid. There was never any time where I felt the book lulled or like where I wanted to put it down or where I felt that something being explained or happening was needless to the story. Everything that was in the story served a purpose. I thought that, you know, Ketchum did a good job building the atmosphere and, you know, making the setting of the town and the neighborhood and stuff. So, you know, I thought that every aspect of this book was very, very good. You know, I would say if you're sensitive to topics of abuse and sexual abuse, you probably shouldn't read this book. But if you can stomach all that and you can handle all that, then I would definitely say give this book a try. Like I said, if you're looking for a horror book that's far more grounded in reality, this one is definitely the way to go. But yeah, so overall, I mean, I give the book 5 stars. You know, I hesitate to call it a great book because, I mean, it sounds like, I mean that more in the sense that, you know, because of how fucked up the book is, to call it a great book seems it's in itself kind of fucked up. But no, like, it was a great book, and it got the message across that it was trying to get across. And, you know, everything about it was great. So I give it 5 out of 5. Highly recommend. Again, if you're sensitive to some of these topics, I probably wouldn't recommend reading it. But if you can handle all that, definitely check out The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum. Excellent read. Disturbing content, but excellent read nonetheless. So, anyways, that's it for this one. I'll be back hopefully soon, and I'll catch you guys later. So, peace, and you guys have a good day. Keep on reading.